So your client is showing as tight or lacking range of motion, so you naturally think that doing some mobility work is what they need to work on. What if I told you that doing this could be the worst thing for their movement mechanics? Today, we're going to look at how to assess whether this is the case or not, and then give you some practical strategies to apply if it is or if it isn't. My name is Ash Grossman. I'm the founder of the Training Stimulus, where we specialize in teaching movement mechanics to rehab professionals, whether you are a physio, an osteo, a chiropractor, a CrossFit coach, or a personal trainer. Today, we're going to get some insight into what part of our movement mechanics mentorship teaches how to assess the lateral hip. So first, a little bit of context for the scenarios that I'm talking about. So here we've got Scott doing one of our classic assessments, the forward lunge with lateral reach to overhead. And as you can see here, he looks pretty limited in terms of how much range of motion he has in his lateral hip, how much hip adduction he's able to access. He's also rotating away, not staying square and sticking to that frontal plane. So you might naturally think, okay, he's tight in that lateral hip. We need to stretch that area to give him more range of motion so he can access a better position for this lunge. But we're going to figure out why that is not the case for Scott. So quick whistle-stop tour of our lateral hip assessment protocol. We break everything down into 3 movement qualities: mobility, stability, and motor control. And we're going to learn how to assess all 3 of those areas quickly today. And then we're going to go through some examples to figure out which one might be somebody's limiter. So first, we're going to look at the stability assessment. So we've got all of our assessments here. So I'm just going to whiz through to find the lateral hip assessment here. So this is our lateral hip stability assessment. So what we are looking for is smooth control and a nice even side bend here. So we've got a nice C shape where we've got pretty even contribution from the lats, the obliques, the lateral hip, glute med, and ITB TFL on the outside of leg as well. The key things are that the movement is smooth and controlled, and we maintain foot contact in all 3 points of contact. So the ball of the big toe, the ball of the pinky toe, and the heel. But the main thing is smoothness that we're looking for here. We're also looking for people rotating or folding over, escaping the frontal plane, which is the one that we're trying to assess. The next assessment, we're now looking at lateral hip mobility. So do they have adequate range of motion in hip adduction? So this time we're going to set up against the wall, a nice stable environment, and we're just going to let our hip drop to touch the wall. If we can successfully contact the wall, we're going to step a little bit further away and keep doing so until we find a range where we start to lose the contact with the big toe. So keep an eye out for that. Some people will do it just accidentally, so you can cue them to keep the ball of the big toe on the ground. And we're looking for how much available hip adduction this person has. Similar to before, we're looking for whether they rotate out of the movement. Are they turning their eyes away? Are they turning their shoulders, twisting their hips to escape the frontal plane? Are they folding forwards? And we're also keeping an eye out for where this range of motion comes from. Does it come from the lats, the obliques, or the lateral hip? So that's the second assessment we're going to do. And then the third one is what we call motor control, or testing it in function. So how well can they use both of these movement qualities of mobility and stability together in a more functional movement, something that relates more to sport or life. So we like lunges because they translate really well to walking and running and also squatting. So here we have a lunge with a lateral reach overhead. So we're assessing how well do we access this hip adduction whilst emphasizing loading of the lateral hip. So you can see I've accessed a decent amount of hip adduction, hip adduction here, and the movement is relatively smooth and controlled. So this one looks potentially a little bit more limited, slightly less hip a deduction on the left side, but it's relatively smooth and controlled. So we can guess that the stability is okay on both sides. So these are obviously demo reps. Let's look at some real examples to bring it to life. So first of all, we have a video from our mentee Rob's client. So this is an example of somebody who lacks mobility. So he's in the lateral hip mobility assessment and he's sending his hip to the wall. He's in a bit of discomfort. He is struggling to get that hip to wall and he's pretty close to the wall. So we can surmise that he is lacking lateral hip mobility, not a huge amount of hip adduction range of motion going on. So on a very simple basis, if he's lacking this movement quality, we can think, okay, he's lacking mobility, let's give him a mobility exercise. So we might prescribe something like our 3-way lateral hip stretch pulses, where we get into this similar setup, leaning against the wall, pushing the hip to the wall, and we're moving the hips in all 3 planes of motion. So forwards and back was the first one, side to side is the second one, and then the third one, we go in the transverse plane. So keeping that hip to wall, we twist around in both directions. So this is a very straightforward way to address a mobility issue. So we've identified he's lacking lateral hip mobility, and we've given him some lateral hip mobility exercises. Nice and simple, right? Next one, we're now looking at an example from another mentee, Phil, and his client. So we're looking at his lateral hip stability. This athlete actually is moving both ways, so we get a double assessment, but we're just going to focus on the lateral hip. So when he loads the outside of this hip, but as you can see, also this hip, it's a real struggle to find his balance. So when he goes over into these positions, loading the lateral hip, he twists out of it, he's wobbling all over the place, he's touching down, he's flexing, he's rotating, anything but loading that lateral hip. He's compensating in many ways. So on a very simple basis, we can say he's lacking lateral hip stability, so we should work on that. So then we can give him some lateral hip stability exercises. So options we have to help somebody with stability, we can give them a toe tap to make the exercise a little bit easier, get that extra checkpoint to help with the balance challenge. We can also go hands overhead to create extra length through the muscles of the trunk and the shoulder, and we can also add weight. The lengthening and the adding of load both increase co-contraction, further helping the individual to stabilize the movement. So with Fred here, we're doing all 3 of those. So he's gone plate overhead, lateral hip stability reach, just a gentle touch down. You can see he's loading up this lateral hip and then coming back to the start position. I like to coach this slightly slower and more controlled to really emphasize the skill component of developing stability. Super straightforward. We're lacking mobility, we give a mobility exercise. We're lacking stability, we give a stability exercise. So how can we double check or reconfirm our findings? So for Rob's athlete here, we can be sure that it's a mobility issue, because when we go into the stability assessment, he's still lacking range of motion, but he's relatively smooth and controlled. He's not touching down, he's not escaping the frontal plane, he's limited in range of motion as he was in the mobility assessment, but we wouldn't describe him as super unstable here. So we're pretty sure that mobility is his limiter. So giving him a mobility exercise is a good way to go. Now we're going to get into a more interesting example. So coming back to Scott, who we started with. So if you looked at him do this lateral hip lunge, we can see that he's limited in his hip adduction. So he's not getting into a great range of motion here in the front plane. However, when we go to his hip mobility assessment, he has a ton of available hip adduction. So you can see here, his big toe is still staying on the ground, but look at this range of motion. This is a huge amount of hip adduction. He's definitely not lacking mobility in this setup, even though he was lacking mobility in the lunge. So that was true on both sides. He had tons of available range of motion. So even though he's showing as immobile in the lunge, see there's not much hip adduction here, in an actual mobility or an isolated mobility assessment, he has tons of range of motion. So why is it that he's not accessing that range of motion in the functional test, in the motor control test? The answer lies in his stability assessments. So if we get him on one foot and ask him to access the range of motion he just accessed in his mobility assessment, the range is far, far less. See, he's touching down, he's really tentative going into those positions, so he can't access nearly as much hip adduction as he could in his mobility assessment because his stability is so lacking, his body doesn't trust him to go there. And that's a really important concept in movement mechanics, that stability enables mobility. So in compound movements, in functional movements, however you want to describe them, we need the right amount of stability and mobility working together in harmony to actually move well. Having excessive mobility can actually be a hindrance because it is so unstable. So we could describe Scott as more towards the hypermobile end of the continuum, where he's got loads and loads of range of motion here, but he's not able to stabilize it. So because he doesn't have the capacity to stabilize it, when we get into a more functional movement, like the lunge here, he's not actually using his lateral hip very effectively. And Scott came in because he'd hit a plateau in his squat strength, and this was part of the issue. So on first glance, we think he might need more mobility, but actually he needs more stability. So working on exercises like this would be more beneficial, or exercises like we gave him, which would be a crossover lunge or a curtsy lunge going backwards to strengthen and stabilize that lateral hip. So something like this, using the same principle of overhead loading to increase muscle length and co-contraction through the load, we step back and across so we get a good amount of length and load through that lateral hip. And this carries over really well to squat mechanics, as this is basically a single leg squat on the forward leg, emphasizing the role of the lateral hip. So if you take one thing away from this video, I hope it's that things that appear to be mobility issues are not always mobility issues. So it's really important that we learn to assess mobility, stability, and motor control all together so that we can establish the root cause of what might be holding back somebody's range of motion. And this is exactly why we teach it like this on the mentorship, because it's not always as obvious as it might seem. That limited range of motion can be because of a mobility issue, but it can equally be from a stability issue. So having the right tests at our disposal to figure out which one's which is going to be really fundamental and important to get to the root cause of your client's issues. I hope that's helpful, guys. If there's anything else you would like to see covered in these videos, please don't hesitate to reach out and drop us a message. But yeah, have a great day, and I'll chat to you soon.